And good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're coming in from. My name is Jason Moore. Welcome to the latest in Brightib's webinar series, A Day in the Life of Cloud Teams, Navigating Multiple Identities, Logins, and Roles. What an audit nightmare. As I said, my name is Jason. I'm lucky enough to work within a really great and talented team here at Brightib. I look after a number of our client relationships and prospective client relationships across the western half of the United States. I'll be moderating the conversation, trying to drive things along, and we'll get into that in a second. But I'll let my co-host here, John Morton, introduce himself, our field CTO. John, over to you for a quick intro.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, John Morton here, Field CTO at Brightif, bridging the gap between sales, product, and engineering as a customer evangelist. And I'll tell you what, one thing, Jason, I'm a huge cloud fan. So as a cloud fan, I really want to make sure we represent what it's like for these folks driving innovation and really, making things work in that balance with security. So this is going to be based on quite a few years now of experience and engaging and looking forward to the conversation.
All right, that's good. That's good. All right, so listen, let's get the housekeeping stuff out of the way, and really the rules. There aren't a lot of rules when it comes to these things, John, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. So, ask us anything. Quite literally, this is a one-way thing. We're talking to you guys through this, both on our webinar platform, but also through LinkedIn Live as well. So if you are connected to the webinar side of things, you can use the Zoom Q&A question and answer section, drop in questions. That's how this actual session has evolved from some of the feedback we got from the last series as well. And for those of you that are interested, that we will put this up early next week on the brightib.com website, so you'll be able to follow this. And again, we constantly encourage everyone that's following this series to continually provide feedback. That's again what we're trying to do here, and that leads me into the concept of today. Right, we're going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes. We're looking to earn your trust and respect. Right, that's the goal of this. If you came here to listen and understand about Brightib, that probably isn't the right session for you to be in, right? The goal of this today, as we said, is it's a day in the life of a cloud team, right? How do they navigate some of the challenges they face? What are the impacts of those challenges, and how are the ways that you can resolve some of those things? How do those cloud teams interact with other organizations? And as I said, how do we ultimately look at some of the impacts that the cloud teams themselves face, the resulting impacts for other teams that they work with, and some ideas and some concepts of how you can resolve some of those challenges, some resolutions that you can find out as well. So we'll just jump into it. So, John, as I said, the first topic that came up from our team was really around, you know, that kind of the multi-cloud aspect. So I put up some ideas of the complexity across CSPs, right? And I want people to hang in there as soon as I say the term multiple CSPs. Some people might say, "Hey, Jason, listen, I only have AWS right now." So I just want you to just sort of hit that one straight out the gate. I'm gonna give you 4 or 5 kind of things to key in as you start to talk about this, right? One of
Right.
the nice things that you and I see as we talk to our customers, right? And I manage a whole range of customers in automotive, finance, et cetera, et cetera. It's a balancing act, right? Between we talk to 3 communities, right? You and I, right? 3 personas, right? Cloud ops, and that's who we're taking the lens today of cloud ops people, right? That's where we're coming from. That's if the audience is listening in, that's how we're thinking about. That's who we are today. That's the persona we're approaching this from today. But we've got to think about security and governance as well. Governance could be identity. By the way, some of these organizations we talk to have hundreds of people. Some of
Yeah.
these companies may have 1 or 2 people in the entirety, right? They could encompass all 3 of these personas, right? Um, I want you to talk about the uniformity, right? The difference between all of these different CSPs, right? I want people to understand, just because you may only have one CSP today, maybe you're heavily focused in Azure or AWS, you probably are multi-cloud, and dig into, John, why you are still multi-cloud.
Yeah.
And as I said, we're going to evolve the conversation today, right? We're going to evolve the conversation from some of the challenges through to what are the impacts and then the resolution. So talk through what some of the the implications of these, the friction that can cause. That makes sense
Yeah,
so
so yeah. So for most cloud operators, when we engage with teams, and what they do, their job, it mainly revolves around, KPIs that are relevant to them, meaning I have a cloud, AWS, for example. My jobs include keeping the applications hosted in the infrastructure alive, up and running, make sure they have the processes and everything they need to keep going. And the second aspect of that is really just helping enhance the functionality of that tool, whether it's through automation, whether it's through operational efficiency, things that really drive the KPIs I'm driven by, getting a release out,
Yep.
making sure this environment's uptime's always there. So yeah, when someone tells me, about multi-cloud, of course I'm not thinking that way. I
No.
just told you what I do. I keep AWS live, but in reality, there's more stuff that folks do engage with. So I don't use, although I keep AWS alive, it's my focus, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, I use maybe Office 365
Right.
or Google Mail. So
Yep.
there's another cloud that I'm not considering. Maybe I'm moving data
Yep.
from
Exactly.
AWS to other buckets and repos. So multi-cloud, the terminology is a little bit interesting from this purview. But in retrospect, when you start to think about it, sure, my job is to keep this one cloud alive. I do that very well, but I do engage with other cloud services or services that are part of my daily job.
Yeah, the other thing that's really interesting, and we saw this, you and I saw this very recently, right? People always think that multi-cloud is a plan, like a 3-year plan, right? And the way I work, I'm more on the commercial side, right? I always look at companies, lots of big companies, they strategically plan. It's always a compelling event, right? But more recently, we've seen a lot of companies get acquisitions, right? And they acquire companies, and that company's on GCP versus AWS, right? So talk a little bit about the unique differences between like a Shoe role and which is a one way to skin the cat in AWS versus GCP, right? There's lots of
Yeah.
uniqueness there, right?
There is. So there's two ways to look at it. Like one is, I can be a smaller shop that's we're very effective, right? Some organizations, they have a handful of people who manage all the infrastructure and they're extremely good at it, very gifted and talented. And then they get told, like to your point, hey, we acquired a new pump company. John, you got to go figure out how to manage not just AWS, but also GCP or Azure. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, the constructs, the IAM constructs alone are radically different. I don't know how these workloads function. I don't know what they are. That's one option. The other is, even if you're a very large organization, right, and you acquire another company and they have AWS as well. So I'm an AWS expert guru. Now all of a sudden I inherited this other AWS environment where they may have architected it differently. Our mantra may have been, we have 50 AWS accounts where we're doing different things across applications, and the acquiring company, they may have one large flat AWS account where they're managing things radically different. So the constructs can be radically different, even between one known, very well-known cloud and just how this, company decided to architect it. Or I got to figure out something new with Google, Oracle, for the love of goodness, Oracle Cloud, right?
Yeah.
So it is a little bit overwhelming where my job is going to be impacted by these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we also see in this space is, obviously for obvious reasons, many companies as they migrate, right? We also see a lot of companies that are doing the opposite, right? We see companies that are making a hybrid strategy, right? Where they are reversing a little bit out of the cloud for certain reasons, primarily economic reasons, where storage is in particular is becoming a cost inhibitor. But we do see this where they start in a single cloud, right? And they build using the native tools. And by the way, again, reminder that this isn't a Brightive product pitch. There are some pretty cool native tools, right? And we see a lot of companies where they're in a single cloud, they can do a pretty cool bang up job of leveraging like some of the native functionality in AWS. But then how do you carry that across when it gets into GCP or when it gets into Azure, right? And then that's where some of the friction comes about. That's for certain. It's like, how do you keep that consistency? Because there's no one same thing across all of those different things. So there is definitely complexity there. But the other thing that we wanted to kind of drive home is that we often get that thing like it doesn't really apply to, it's not applicable. Uniformity doesn't apply to me because I'm really only in AWS. And we see this a lot of the time, right? That CSP extends beyond, right? Because you are doing that data migration. You are, working with, pulling data from different repos, or you are working with, like I said, the G Suite or the Office
Right.
365 suite.
And happens a lot more often than not, where your CTO may say, just based on economics, all that effort you put in AWS, we're going with Google now
Yeah,
because of
yeah.
financials. So yeah, you got to
And it can
forward
happen, like
thinking.
I said, that acquisition thing is definitely a driver, that I've seen personally in my day-to-day life is that's a driver because suddenly it just arrives. And now
Yep.
you're trying to figure out how do you get the uniformity? Because the one thing, the number one thing I want to drive here is the friction, right? And the friction
Mhm.
really leads us, as I said, hopefully we're doing a nice job here, John, of leading into the next thing, which is what are the implications, right? What happens to that, right? Because the number one thing that you don't want is the friction, right? Because at the end of the day, we're coming at this at the lens of a cloud user, right? The
Mhm.
cloud user, the operator, they're there to do a job, right? Maybe it's a site reliability engineer, or maybe it's the folks that are keeping up that cloud infrastructure, or the teams that are managing the reliability or implementing those environments, maintain that infrastructure, whatever it is, right? Their task is to keep that thing alive, right? To bring them bread and butter in the door, right? So, what are the ultimate implications of that friction, right? And the reality is the best way to say it is corners being cut, right? And we
Mhm.
heard this the other day, and I'll kick it off. And this is kind of really interesting because you and I were prepping for this last week, right? And we were talking to a prospect, right? And the prospect was a referral, right? Our entry point into customers generally tends to be security, right? But then it's a Y split, right? John, would you agree? It's a
Right.
Y split, right?
Absolutely. Because security, they
Go on.
need the help from the cloud teams in this case. Yes.
Yeah. So security wants, if they do it right, and it's always our guidance, right? Is it's a village, right? And I'm sorry, it's a cheesy analogy, but it is. It's a village, right? If anyone's going to be successful in this, we really need, particularly the user community, to come on board at minimum, right? Identity is an interesting thing, right? Because identity in the cloud is something that is unique, right? Like
Mhm.
particularly in AWS, the notion of usernames and credentials changes, particularly with the Shum role, right? Like there's a lot there. Maybe John, you can unpack that as we get into this thing, right? But I'll give you this analogy, and it ties to these kind of these bullet points here that we're going to talk about. But this one, we get into this through a referral. A security user, is trying to immerse this new company in the way that Brightive looks at it, trying to help in this particular company. So we're very excited. The user gives us an example. It says, "Hey, I'm having this fight with funny enough with security because they want to get access to my machine. They want to back it up." And we were talking to him, and he says, "The reason why I don't want to do this is because of the sensitivity of the data on my local device." And we were like, what do you mean?" And it basically exposes to us that he has keys for production systems on his machine. Now, he's not trying to be a nefarious, he's trying to be a good corporate citizen. But what he explains to us is that the process to do his job day in, day out, to go fetch those keys, to get access to those production environments, to just keep the lights on for the company was so painful that he felt it was a significant risk for him, for the IT to go and back this data setup, right? Because again, now you had these critical keys, but the whole point was the access to these environments was the showstopper there. So John,
Yeah.
talk about some of those implications that come from that friction.
Yeah. And this is why I like having this conversation and what I want security practitioners to hear. Nobody's trying to do anything nefarious in our experience. Everybody wants to do the right thing. They genuinely do. But when security makes it hard and they're telling me I got to log into a proxy to do this thing, or I got to jump through these hoops to get XYZ, remember, I started it off by saying my KPIs aren't driven by what security does for me. They're driven by what I need to do to keep environments alive. Everybody from the CTO down can get fired if our production environment is down, right? So just look at it from that lens, that purview, right? Of I understand you want me to do these things. I get it, but I need to do these things. So in this case in point, when you have access keys, tokens, credentials in a notepad on your desktop, normally folks are doing that because of the complexity security's introduced and getting access to the things I need,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Especially in a resource they don't understand. Sometimes it's not about like even usernames, credentials vaulted in some machine in some world that requires approval. It's just the day-to-day stuff too, and even lower environments. In lower environments, I may want to do things. So where there's complexity in my KPIs of, keeping things alive and automating and making them fast, I'm not cutting corners because I'm a bad person. It's
Yeah,
not
right.
because I don't like security. It's
Yeah,
because that's how I'm driven,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And I think that's the key thing, right? Like just being able to everything, like finding out ways, like even from an on-call perspective, simplifying the processes to give people access when they need it and right when they need it. That's again, that's the sort of stuff that, there's technology and there's ways to solve those problems so that you can simplify it so that people can get the access when they need it completely transparently, right? It doesn't have
Yeah.
to be this laborious task,
It
right?
could be a conversation too, just to highlight that. I don't want to make it sound like, it's all negative. Security teams will often come and beat on ops teams and say, I need this to be least privilege. I don't even know what you're trying to tell me or why. Like,
Right.
why are you telling me? All I know is you're giving me an account or something, the privilege that I need, and it works.
Yeah.
You're not explaining to me, security, why I need to do this, because my KPIs are say, John, just go make this thing work. Go
Yeah.
fix this thing. What are you
That's
telling me? Least privilege? How does that
yeah.
help me?
That
Right?
was the other thing, right? I often say, once an admin, always an admin, and I think I got picked up quite correctly. I think from a cloud operator's lens, they just need what they need to do their job. They don't care. They're
Yes.
not. It's not like rank has its privilege. It's not like they want a little badge like that says I'm an admin. They just need the
Yeah.
specific capability to go and do their task. They're not.
The
It's not like
production
they don't
environment's
want
down.
the title that they're a super
Yeah.
admin. They just need the specific
Every second
ability.
counts in those environments, and
Yeah,
that's my KPIs. I want to get
yeah.
it fixed. I need to keep it alive. I don't got time to. So yeah, it's just a conflict of ideas there.
And what I'm going to do as we move into the next section, for the audience here, and I'll check in the Q&A as well, just in case there's anything here. As we leave this section, I want to drop something in the channel here. Brightiv put out a report. It's a survey. It's a state of privilege and identity report, right? It's the most recent one. It's from last year. But I want to leave you with something, a thought, and maybe take a read of it, right? I'm not going to give you a link to our website. I'm just going to drop the report, right? So you don't have to go through a gating factor to get to this, right? There's about 40,000 different permissions across the four major CSPs. 40,000 different permissions across them. 50% of those 40,000, so 20,000 permissions, would be ranked as high risk permissions, and less than 1% of them are truly ever needed. So, but but a huge percent of them are occupied and leveraged that's when we surveyed a whole host of customers, that's what we found. So there's 40,000 different permutations of permissions out there, and no easy way to kind of control them, right, and give access to them. But there's so many different variations of how you can apply permissions across the CSP. So I'll drop that in the chat if I can figure out how to do that, John. I'll do that here in a second as well.
Absolutely.
But I would share that out. The next topic was really the best practices, right? So again, so we've kind of talked about some of the challenges that face, right? So we're saying, coming from a cloud operator's perspective, they need to do their job. There's some friction that comes about, right? That friction, by the way, generates ripples, right? Because security wants to help. They need to put controls in place, right? That's why they exist. Governance is there because, like, particularly for some of the customers I work within, like the financial space, right? They're highly regulated, right? So the best practices, the term I hear all the time. By the way, it used to be from the big four, right? It used to be from the big consultant firms. They'd say blast radius, right? I heard this from an operator the other day. I heard this term from an operator. Someone said, hey, the blast radius. And this is one of our customers. And they said, hey, listen, we use the term blast radius when we educate our users, right? And he gave his example, right? So this is a customer that has something like 4,000 users that work with us today, 4,000 human users that work with us today. They've done a huge education process. And historically, they used to do, again, this is a JSON terminology, by the way, probably not a cloud terminology. I apologize. But they used to do account stuffing, right? So multiple applications for a for a business owner, right? They'd stuff as many applications for their department within a single AWS account because it was just easier for this exact reason, right? Put loads
Yeah.
and loads of things into one AWS account because then I just have one account to manage and access and secure, right? Huge security nightmare because now I can get in, I can disrupt all of this stuff from one thing, right? So this particular
Yeah.
customer said, hey, let's segment this stuff because from a cost perspective, it's negligible. So let's segment this stuff. So when they said one app to one account, the customer started, the downstream end user started hyperventilating, not
Right.
realizing that there are technology and tools now, admittedly, obviously with ourselves, but it could quite easily be with the CSP themselves as well, because it was within one system. But you know, there are ways for you to limit the blast radius by segmenting this stuff, right? By tiering and segmenting. It doesn't have to be scary, but it's tied to education as well, John. So do you want to walk through?
Yeah. So I think to put a little bow on that example, like anybody who's an AWS fan knows that using multiple AWS accounts is a beautiful thing. You can do this very well. Where that heartburn comes from and that cardiac arrest is when security's telling me I have to have all the controls across each of these accounts different. So yeah, I'd rather have one flat org where I can do anything I want. Security doesn't even know half the time what I'm doing in that one. But when they work together and we're saying, look, if we have multiple AWS accounts and we just make it easy for me to get access and we can have cross account access between them and use the cloud the way it's designed, man, that's win-win for everyone. But evolving that conversation is radically difficult because if you tell the cloud ops teams, you have to segment each of these accounts simply, right? And then you're like, okay, cool, no problem. And then they're like, by the way, we're going to try to put some tool in front where you're going to proxy into each one and we're going to manage access to each one. That's where the heartache comes. Why are you making my life hard when we're trying to make it easier? So if you can find that happy medium
Yep.
between managing the access in that case, right, and how it works, it's better. Case in point, right? AWS, I'll pick on it real quick. If you have multiple accounts, you can use things like role assumption. You can
Yep.
get away from things like Identity Center and go to a centralized store. There
Yep.
is a way to simplify how these users are logging in using native AWS CLI tooling where they can do these things where the tiering and the segmentation exists. Network architecture, everything's beautiful, but their job doesn't have to get any harder because we're leveraging what the cloud is trying to do for us in this AWS example. So as
Yep.
long as we can bridge that gap, it's good, right? It can be
Yeah,
effective.
exactly. I think the key thing is like, and the one thing I want to point out here is it's that the village mentality, right? Like, yeah, again, some like that. Again, this is going to turn into a little. That's where technology partners can play a role. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have 4,000 people in an organization that understand this stuff, that's when you can turn to companies like Brightive, right?
Exactly.
So, but that I would leverage the village, right? That's where I think that's why I put the education piece in here, right? It's like when you see particularly cloud and security work together well, and they understand how they can architect and how they can work better together, that's when I think it's a truly best practice thing when they understood like we're not going to cut corners anymore. There's an effective stream way to unify and simplify this, which ultimately secures the way we do things, right? That's the
Right.
mantra that Brightif has: unify, simplify, secure, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the way to move forward, right? So the last topic, really, before we kind of move into um, the last segment, some Q&A and just some ideas, switching a little bit to gears into the security, what security should be asking of the cloud teams, right? But let's just talk about making the move to JIT, right? I love the term JIT. It's one of the most twisted and distorted terms, right? Just in time. If there's anyone that has interest, like hit John up and I up on the term just in time because it is one of the most abused term acronyms out there right now. But let's talk it through, right? Like let's talk about how do you make that transition, right? Let's just say you're in then right now. Some of the stuff we've talked about resonates. There is some friction. Maybe you've tried to build something yourself. You
Mm-hmm.
are interested in understanding how you can okay, maybe you are a cloud ops user or you're a security user that's empathizing with what we're saying. How do we make that move to a more dynamic environment? What are the kind of
Yeah.
the next steps you would advise on?
Yeah, number one, just be open-minded to the fact, security teams, that the cloud is different. Okay. And what do I mean by that? I promise you, if you show up to your AWS ops team and you tell them, hey, I got this proxy, it's going to work perfectly for you, you're immediately going to get like shut down. And it happens over the past few years. Teams are starting to realize this. Engage with the cloud team. Ask them what they like about AWS. What is it that you like about it? Operators that are consumers of our security product, right? We don't want to make your life hard. How do we make it easy? And a lot of the times they'll tell you it's the native tooling. It's the simplicity of using things like API. It's the simplicity of using things like just-in-time access. They exist natively in the cloud. It's not some retro archaic security company 20 years old trying to tell you how to do things. The cloud is doing this. So
Yeah.
figure out how they can work together, right? And then say, okay, cool. I understand what you like about it. How do we make that work? Is
Yeah.
there a solution on the market that does it? Right?
Yeah.
Can we use native tooling smartly? This is where it gets a little fun, right? Because it's like, well, we've invested in all this other stuff, how we make it work together. But it's that conversation, right? Because I promise you, I am a huge fan of cloud. Cloud is very unique in how they're trying to manage access, authentication, authorization. They have literally separated them. If anybody knows anything about role assumption, the
Yeah.
best thing AWS ever did was a 12-hour max SCP, right? Security
Yeah.
control policy. No
Yeah.
session can exceed that. So it's understanding these things, working with these tools in teams, and don't make their life hard. Don't show up with something you think you understand. Ask a few more questions. What are you trying to do? What do you like about the cloud? That'll make it a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think for me personally, one of the things I've seen recently is just the aha moments of people seeing the difference with the that ephemeral component, right? Like, you know, that short-lived session, right? Like it evaporates, right? It's ephemeral. It disappears when you terminate the session. It could be in Azure, it could be GCP, it could be in AWS. When you use the term just in time correctly, it's gone. It's
Right.
dissolved. The session is terminated, right?
Hmm.
When a lot of these terminologies is really just enough, right? It's creating a token, that token exists. It's just gating your access to that environment, right? That session, again, there's a lot here, and people they start to realize, okay, there's ways around this, right? I could bypass this and still get exactly right. So be very, very careful when you hear the term just in time, make sure you understand, the nature of that, right? And again, this isn't a product pitch. It's just telling you there's ways to do this through API
There are.
calls and setting it up and tearing down things very, very
It's not
small.
limited to cloud either. Like I'll
Yeah.
use this
Yeah.
point in example, domain admin groups in Active Directory.
Yeah.
For the love of God, I've been harping about this for a while now. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be static access. There are
Yeah.
ways to manage those privileges
Yeah.
smartly. And the
Right.
end user, I just told you, as an operator, all I care about is I have access to what I need when I need it. Don't make me jump through hoops. Don't make my life hard. Otherwise, I'm going to figure out a way around it. If you can make that seamless, where the cloud makes it so much easier, trust me, it does. I'm going to be happy.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think we're running up on time here a little bit, but this was
I think
really
we do
good.
have a question in the chat there.
We do. Let's have a look.
Yeah.
You
It
want to read
says,
it out? Let's have a look.
let's say I do have a situation where now there's another cloud infra being brought in quickly because of an acquisition. Where should my team start with figuring out what needs to be done to get visibility and start securing the new platform?
All right, John, you want to?
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that.
Yeah, yeah.
Always, you know, always number one, right? You ask a couple basic questions. How are you doing it today? Right? How are they managing and monitoring that infra today? Hopefully they are. If they're not, right? Chances are people have invested in a ton of CSPM tools. My favorite is, some like Wiz and Orca. They're really good about reporting problems of this new cloud. Then what? That's my favorite question for those guys. Thank you for telling me all these problems. That's when you have to look for other tooling, right? That can actually eliminate some of those standing access, overprivileged access tools like Brightive that really fit that
Yeah.
mantra. But that would be my MO. Ask the questions, figure out if you have visibility now, and then actually do something about it. Don't just deliver a report that says we now know. Do
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I mean, again, that does kind of takes us a little bit out of our kind of kind of like building trust thing. But yeah, that's why we exist, right? Like, when tools like Brightive connect, like the first thing that our solution does is scan that environment. We're going to tell you exactly what you have, right? What standing, static, high risk privileges you have, right? And then it would unify exactly what you've done with the other platforms that you've connected to Brightive with that other CSP. The whole three words that describe what we do: unify, simplify, secure. So that would be the
Yeah.
answer there. So
So hopefully that helps with that question. But good question. But yeah,
great.
overall, it's just remember, I think the conversation is critical. Ops has different drivers. Nobody gets paid for doing security better on the operations side. My KPIs revolve around keeping things alive and improving automation. How do we make that easy? Come on, security. Ask me a
Yeah.
few questions before you throw something at me.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it from, and again, as I said, that I think that's where the challenge sits, right? I mean, I think every single one of these platforms, before we jump into these critical questions, and John, if you can monitor that, and see if there's any more questions that come in, but that's the biggest challenge that the community faces, right? Yeah, we can unify the community between internally within that customer group, within that individual customer, those three, the ops team, the cloud ops team, the cloud users, the security team, and the governance and identity folks. We can get you all in a room and have you all holding hands and working together, unified. The challenge still becomes there is still that kind of diversity between all of the different platforms themselves, right? There's some pretty big differences between how Microsoft is doing it to Google to AWS, right? And that's
Mhm.
where, like I said, that's where you have some partnerships available to you out there, right? It doesn't have to be as scary as well.
Exactly.
Last thing we wanted to leave you with some critical questions that the security should ask of their cloud teams, right? The first one was, the bottlenecks that you face today, right? There are bottlenecks, we guarantee it, right? Like I said, I haven't seen it yet, John. I don't know about you, but sometimes it might be it's one of the classics we see. Sometimes we'll do a couple of discovery calls. We'll go into testing phases, and it might be 3 or 4 meetings, and suddenly someone will bring up, hey, I use Terraform, or I use this particular kind of IAC tool, or hey, I'm fed up of copying, pasting, credentials to my AWS CLI, and we're like, well, hey, we can help you solve that's painful. Or I work in 200 accounts. We've got 1,500 AWS accounts, and I need to work in 200 every single week. Ask them what the bottlenecks are, right? That's the first one, John. I don't know if you want to explode out on that real quick.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, right? Because they're going to cut corners, so you don't want them
Yeah.
to, So just ask that question. What is rough about what we're doing? How, you know, show me where it hurts, and then we can fix it.
Yeah. The next one is pretty obvious, but just in case, right? Like, I mean, their understanding of the data that they're handling, and making sure they understand the sensitivity of it, and then making sure that both the security teams that are working together on the secure and safe practices element of it. Again, no one's trying to. Yeah, we've never met anyone that's trying to be nefarious or a cave dweller, right? So just make sure that they understand the sensitivity of the data, that they understand the practices. We recently had, and again, it wasn't nefarious anyway, but a health tech company where the development and the cloud team just went off and built a new stack right in a CSP, and they were loving it, but the
They
security
were
team had
so
no
happy.
clue.
They were so happy. They got to build with immunity, and then security showed up. It was
So yeah, so do need controls, but again, like making sure people understand that. And in their case, they felt like they weren't handling sensitive data, right? But it
right.
still needs controls, right? And then the last one is ask the teams, right? Like, what do they like? I mean, I just hit on it, right? Some people love AWS console, right? For example, so that's how some users go to work every day in, day out. Others love the CLI, right? Some users I mean, like for us, like at Brightive, we have a CLI tool that you can live in, and you can work across multi clouds from one command line. Now
Yep.
for maybe an SRE, that's music to his or her ears, because now they're suddenly never leaving one terminal window, right? Which has never been seen before for them. They're normally going to different tools and copy and pasting credentials. So ask them, do they have any recommendations on tools that align with their current workflow? Because again,
Exactly.
that's something that we've seen really work well. Any more questions in the chat, John, before
Not
we?
that I've seen, no. I think, people are taking it in, analyzing it critically. Nothing new.
Again, well, the concept of the Brightive series is to just, we have John himself and a number of the team here have been practitioners in the cloud and identity space for decades. So the goal as we said with Brightive, is less around positioning our own product, but trying to talk around this kind of problem impact and how we can resolve those areas. So hope you enjoyed today's session. It will be posted up early next week on the brightive.com website. And as I said, I did drop in the recent report, which had some really interesting findings. So again, thank you for joining us on the webinar platform or on LinkedIn Live, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.